I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics. Messianicapologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for November the 12th, 2025. Today on our theology roundup, we are continuing from yesterday with a survey of the composition of 2 Corinthians. Yesterday we did 1 Corinthians. Today we'll do 2 Corinthians. Now, I do have a short correction to make. This does happen from time to time. I said that I thought it was useful if we would survey 1 Corinthians and the 2 Corinthians so we can address later on 1 Corinthians 7 through 24, Paul's rule in all the assemblies, all the churches. That is still planned probably for next week. And also 1 Corinthians 9, the different I became statements. Well, we addressed 1 Corinthians 9 on the July 15th, 2025 episode of Messianic Insider. And while I'm not against repeating things, from time to time, because it's only been 4 months or so, we're not going to be addressing 1 Corinthians 9 in the immediate future again. But go to the back episodes, July the 15th, we did address that. So it was useful that I discovered that today. From time to time, we will repeat a topic, but it's usually going to be a much shorter thing, and it's very important. But in this case, we've already addressed it. But tentatively planned for us to address 1 Corinthians 7 and Paul's rule next week. Thursday and Friday, so that's tomorrow and Friday, we're probably going to be addressing, I haven't finalized it yet, but Matthew 23, 2 and 3, who sits in the seat of Moses? A number of you have been asking about that topic. All right, so the composition of 2 Corinthians, continuing from yesterday. This is taken from our ministry workbook, a survey of the Holy Scriptures for the practical Messianic. It's a compilation of the previous survey of the Tanakh and survey of the Apostolic Scriptures workbooks released in 2024, last year, available in both paperback as well as ebook for Amazon Kindle. And this is effectively perhaps the only introduction to the Holy Scriptures textbook anywhere in the Messianic community, which actually goes into detail regarding authorship, date, both conservative as well as liberal perspectives. We don't try to hide some of that. And today, as we get into the composition, the composition of 2 Corinthians, we're doubtlessly going to be getting into some of these things. Okay. Yeah, there we go. All right, so let's get into the composition of 2 Corinthians. The second epistle of Paul to the Corinthians, and this is, of course, the second canonical epistle of Paul. There are questions about 1 Corinthians. We discussed this yesterday. It's the first canonical letter to the Corinthians, but there's some other extant letter out there. And so much of 1 Corinthians is spent going back and forth regarding a conversation Paul had with the Corinthians, either from a written letter or from oral reports sent to him, especially with the different Corinthian slogans like everything is permitted for me. Now, when we get into 2 Corinthians, there is, while many expositors treat 2 Corinthians chapters 1 through 13 as a full letter written to the Corinthians, there are others who think that this might be a redaction together or a compilation together of multiple pieces of correspondence. So keep that in mind. Okay, the personal survey of 2 Corinthians, if you've got the Survey of the Holy Scriptures workbook, you are intended to sit down with the letter of 2 Corinthians, read it in a single sitting, and then with a journal or log notebook, write down things like people, places, key themes and events, and major scripture passages. And you're going to pick up, of course, a lot of things in just your Bible reading that way. All right, the theological summary of 2 Corinthians. The approximate date, the winter of 56 or 57 CE. The time period, a season of extreme growing pains for the Corinthian congregation in the midst of many challenging Paul's apostolic authority. The author, the Apostle Paul. The location of author, Macedonia or Ephesus. The target audience and their location, Jewish and non-Jewish believers in Corinth. And 2 Corinthians, I think, unlike 1 Corinthians, even though there are difficult passages Messianics have to sort through, especially some of the remarks in 2 Corinthians 3, it doesn't get as much attention as 1 Corinthians. But one of the most notable things about 2 Corinthians is that we learn a lot about Paul, the pastor, Paul, the individual, Paul's personal psychology from 2 Corinthians, Paul the person, perhaps more than any other epistle. The text, which is often called 2 Corinthians, is unanimously agreed by today's conservatives and liberals to have been written by the Apostle Paul, 2 Corinthians 1:1, 10:1, even though Timothy is listed as a co-sender, 2 Corinthians 1:1. Perhaps unlike any of his other letters, 2 Corinthians contains more autobiographical material, and one learns much about Paul the person in this composition. Pauline authorship of 2 Corinthians has not been substantially challenged, but it was not as well known to the 2nd and 3rd century Christian church compared to some of Paul's other letters. A huge part of the debate among interpreters regarding 2 Corinthians concerns whether 2 Corinthians was a single letter or was actually some kind of a composition of several letters or pieces of letters. Conservatives generally argue for some kind of unity for the epistle, whereas liberals tend to think that 2 Corinthians was a composition of several letters and or fragments of correspondence. According to some scenarios, 2 Corinthians may be the 4th letter which Paul wrote to the believers in Corinth. Murray J. Harris validly points out, quote, "There is probably no part of Paul's life more difficult to reconstruct accurately than the period of 30 or so months he spent in and around Ephesus, perhaps from the fall of AD 53 to the spring of AD 56, unquote. Expositor's Bible Commentary. For certain, the bulk of Paul's writing the Corinthians was to rebuke and admonish them for the problems they faced. 2 Corinthians 2:4 indicates, "For out of much affliction and anguish of heart, I wrote to you with many tears, not so that you would be made sorrowful, but that you might know the love which I have especially for you." New American Standard. This does indicate that a previous piece of writing preceded his writing in 2 Corinthians, but what that piece of writing was has been debated by expositors. The first and most obvious candidate for the piece of writing referenced is the letter of 1 Corinthians. There are other interpreters, though, who think that it may be a lost letter of stern rebuke. Robert Gundry summarizes, quote, "After writing 1 Corinthians from Ephesus, Paul found it necessary to make a painful visit to Corinth and back. Painful because of the strained relation between him and the Corinthians at the time. Luke does not record this visit in Acts. It is to be inferred, however, from 2 Corinthians 12:14, 13:1 and 2, where Paul describes his coming visit as the third," unquote. The existence of 2 Corinthians as a fourth letter creates some problems for exegetes trying to recreate the circumstances by which 2 Corinthians was composed. Of course, more than anything else, if 2 Corinthians were indeed a fourth letter in a series Paul wrote to the Corinthians, it indicates once again how spiritually immature these people were and how they indeed had some major problems. Another proposal which some have suggested is that 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13 made up the sorrowful letter Paul referred to earlier in the text, while many conservatives are agreed that 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13 were a part of the original text or yet another piece of text written later. This is a useful possibility which deserves some consideration when examining the whole of 2 Corinthians. In the most extreme case, this would mean that Paul wrote a total of 5 letters to the Corinthians, including letter A, the non-extant first letter, letter B, 1 Corinthians, letter C, a non-extant third letter, letter D, the canonical 2 Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians chapters 1 through 9, letter E, 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13. Still, in spite of all this possible writing, the epistle known as 2 Corinthians, quote, was written out of Paul's deep thankfulness for the favorable turn in his relations with the Corinthians. Paul was a realist, however. He knew that the worst of the trouble was over, but that did not mean there was no further cause for concern, unquote. Leon Morris, International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. The epistle of 2 Corinthians was composed sometime after the epistle of 1 Corinthians, probably about 6 months or so afterward, but no more than a year. If one can assume that Paul's travels detailed in 1 Corinthians 16, 5 through 8, point to a spring 56 or 57 CE time frame, then it is likely that 2 Corinthians was written sometime in the following winter. A likely place of composition is Macedonia, 2 Corinthians 2:13, 7:5, although some also favor Ephesus. Like the epistle of 1 Corinthians, no original composition in Hebrew or Aramaic has ever been proposed by anyone in the scholastic community for the epistle of 2 Corinthians. It is only limited to those in the Messianic community who want it to be so. It is an historical impossibility. When coupled with the epistle of 1 Corinthians and compared with the background material of Acts chapter 18 and the late first century composition of 1 Clement, the epistle of 2 Corinthians provides Bible readers a good idea about many of the internal dealings in the first century community of faith. It specifically offers a framework for many of the interpersonal and societal issues which face the ecclesia at large. 2 Corinthians also gives readers a wide amount of insight into the Apostle Paul as a person and how he handled difficulty. Why Paul composed this letter to the Corinthians is a slight challenge for some interpreters, but should not be too difficult to determine. It is often proposed that the purpose for Paul writing 2 Corinthians was that his admonitions laid out in 1 Corinthians, and likely other previous communications, were not met. Paul made a brief visit to Corinth to try to remedy the situation, which did not help because false teachers and false apostles had entered in and were challenging his authority. 2 Corinthians 11:4, 12:11. After Paul's visit, which was mainly a disaster, he then wrote the Corinthians a severe letter, 2 Corinthians 2:4. This letter may be non-extant, or, as some have proposed, maybe 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13. Later, Paul met Titus in Macedonia, 2 Corinthians 7, 6, and 7, who brought a good report from Corinth, and this improved situation necessitated the writing of 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13 present the biggest challenge for the interpreter because it is a severe rebuke which seems to be disjointed from the larger, more positive context of the letter. Those who see 2 Corinthians as a whole work, rather than two letters or multiple pieces redacted together, think that Titus did bring some negative news with him to Paul as well. And 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13 address this. Some evangelical scholars, though, think this was another letter written to the Corinthians at a later date by Paul and then was added to the document, which became known as 2 Corinthians. Also, not to be overlooked is the possibility that the epistle of 2 Corinthians was finished in stages, making the letter a whole composition, but not written all at once. There may have been a period when the letter was left unfinished for weeks due to the ministry work conducted by Paul in Macedonia, and later the material was picked up again. Regardless of what theory or position one holds regarding the composition of 2 Corinthians, if 2 Corinthians was originally several letters or pieces of correspondence edited together, readers still have the responsibility to deal with the text in its final canonical form. For your average evangelical Protestant today, encountering 2 Corinthians, the letter serves to tell whether or not the problems seen in Corinth were at all resolved. What do today's Messianic people do with the epistle of 2 Corinthians? Most of the discussion surrounding the composition of 2 Corinthians and whether it is a single letter or a redacted series of letters will be viewed as academically interesting, but not too important in terms of the larger issues of interpreting the text of 2 Corinthians. What will draw the most attention for Messianic readers of 2 Corinthians concerns the various vignettes issued on topics important to the Corinthian situation and whether the problems encountered in 1 Corinthians were at all resolved. A section of difficulty for many Messianics regards the issue of Moses, the veil, and the Old Covenant in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. Is the Old Covenant to be regarded as the Torah and Tanakh scriptures passing away, or the ministry of death and condemnation nullified by Yeshua's sacrifice for those who are in him? There is definitely much need for improvement in Messianic appreciation and understanding of 2 Corinthians. Okay, so didn't want to leave any of you all hanging, of course, addressing the composition of 1 Corinthians yesterday because we had recently gone through 1 Corinthians 8 and then later 1 Corinthians 10. What do we do with 1 Corinthians? And then, of course, 2 Corinthians later. But, in my examination, and this goes all the way back to our old, Wednesday night Bible study podcast from, let me recall this, 2015 and then 2016, and then, 1 Corinthians and then 2 Corinthians for the practical Messianic commentaries. 1 Corinthians has, a lot of factionalism. It's got these, Corinthian slogans which have to be dealt with. There are translation issues, there are background issues, there are perspective issues, there are issues of logic to be considered. 2 Corinthians, which of course hopefully reflects on how many of the Corinthians improved themselves. They took Paul's warnings seriously. 2 Corinthians is very different in that you get to see Paul, the individual, Paul speaking, autobiographically, Paul discussing, who he is as a servant to the Corinthians, the concerns he's had for them, and it takes on a much different tenor, and not only a different tenor compared to 1 Corinthians, but compared to some of his other letters. And so much of what 2 Corinthians does when you read it, especially if you are in any kind of position of leadership or teaching, it causes you to think about, your service to the Lord and some of the difficulties you faced, whether it's serving people and some of the inevitable challenges people will present you with, but also as you consider who you are and some of the challenges and difficulty and ridicule and maybe even persecution you have faced. So if you are in any kind of position of leadership or teaching, doesn't matter if you're a pastor, Messianic rabbi, Messianic teacher, if you only facilitate things, you moderate things, take a good look at 2 Corinthians and try to identify with the difficulties Paul faced. All right, so we're going to switch windows back. And yes, once again, this study has been taken from our ministry workbook, A Survey of the Holy Scriptures for the Practical Messianic. You can find it at outreachisraelbookstore.com. All right, so we don't have a lot of news to go through, but we do have some things to review. Of course, we do the news roundup after the theology roundup because the news is time sensitive and it changes from day to day. We are continually reminded to, number one, be praying for peace, Israel, Gaza, the Middle East. Number two, be praying for peace, Russia and Ukraine. And of course, number three, pray for reason and sanity to prevail here on the American home front. And then just peace in the world. We need to be praying for there's so many things we need to be interceding about, especially as we approach the Thanksgiving holiday, the December holidays, and we approach the end of calendar year 2025. Okay, so all the links I'm about to go through, there's not that many stories. They will be available for you to access later today when this episode is archived at messianicapologetics.net. And that way you can watch the different clips in fully. You can read the articles fully. And some of you all may have noticed on the Messianic Apologetics website that with a number of episodes, we had to pull the list of episodes, the list of news links off. That's just temporary because there were some technical problems with linking the embedded code from X, or formerly Twitter. We had way too many of them on our website and we got an error message. So hopefully by the end of the week or so, all of those back episodes which don't have the links, they will be all corrected. So we're just going to have basically a text link, colon, and then the link. We've got July, August, and September to still go through. So if you were looking at something in the past and you were like, I couldn't find this, where is it? It was because of a technical issue we had embedding the Twitter code. That's the kind of thing which goes on behind the scenes. With a ministry like ours, we don't tend to talk about it, but it was nothing other than that. Okay, so our first story, this is from Vivid on X, and there's a 25-second clip here. Israel is a miracle. We are a very tiny nation surrounded by so many enemies, yet we are still standing, still alive, still thriving. It's not just strength, it's God. God is with Israel. He promised and he keeps his word. Israel is here to stay. And of course, you see, pictures of the Holy Land, pictures of Israel. You have to remember what this was like a century ago and how the Israelis have indeed made the desert bloom. Now, along with that, especially for those of us who are Bible believers, we got questions about, is the creation of the state of Israel a fulfillment of prophecy? Isaiah 66:8, a nation born in a day. I believe it is. But is the state of Israel the end all of God's plan? No, it is not the restored messianic kingdom, but it is a definite installment toward that. And one of the things which I don't think we discuss enough sometimes is how there have been many unreligious Jews, non-religious Jews, non-observant Jews, agnostic, atheistic Jews, and they look at the prophets, they think, oh, this is interesting, but they see the return of Israel, the return of the Jewish people to the promised land. They see the rebirth of the state of Israel. They see the Tanakh scriptures. And while they no, obviously more has got to come, it really strikes them that with all the opposition the modern state of Israel has faced, both with its creation by the United Nations, the initial war for independence, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, other conflicts up to the present. I mean, this country should never exist in the first place by all human reasoning. Secondly, at a number of points in history in the past 50 to 70 years, this country should have been snuffed out by its hostile Arab and Islamic neighbors, and yet it still exists. To a lot of non-religious Jews or agnostic, atheistic Jews, this actually serves as definitive proof that God has to exist. How else could these things have taken place? How else could this people group, dispersed into the nations for over 2 millennia, return home after Hitler's Holocaust with virtually nothing, with all of these hostile enemies, with world opinion decisively turned against it, and exist for as long as it has? So I think we need to sometimes remember that, and remember that while, yes, we pray for the salvation of the Jewish people, that they turn to faith in the one God of Israel, Yeshua the Messiah, that they also acknowledge the existence of God. And if this is how God gets many agnostic and atheistic Jews to recognize that he is, and from there, that look at what he has done with his people, he's faithful to the promises of return and restoration, that they can be a ready field for hearing about the message of Yeshua. So, yeah, very, very important to keep that in mind. All right, let's move on to our next story. This is from Open Source Intel. There's a 56-second clip. I thought this was interesting. We know yesterday was Veterans Day here in the United States. This is from the ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. Trump: we have officially renamed the Department of Defense back to the original name, Department of War. And remember, we won World War I, we won World War II, we won everything in between. We won everything that came before, and then we brilliantly decided to change the name. We became politically correct. And I'm sure from that, what he means is that perhaps, just perhaps, the United States military is now on a much more decisive victory footing. I'm sure that's what Trump means. And while we have seen Trump as this peacemaking president, broker deals between India and Pakistan, Cambodia and Thailand, Israel and its neighbors. He's working on Russia, Ukraine. We also have the conflict that's brewing in Venezuela. What's that all about? We got a story about that. You know, Trump's trying to be the peace president, but at least from having the position of the Department of War rather than just the Department of Defense, what that implies, at least for him, is that, look, if you don't make peace, if you don't, get this thing sorted out, we're going to use the full-on might of the United States and we're going to resolve it by force. I think that's what a lot of this Department of War business is about. Look, I'm going to support our men and women in uniform, whether it's Department of Defense or Department of War. But I know that a lot of people have been like, that sounds, like warmongering. He's going to go out there and create all these conflicts. Whereas I think instead it has to do with the perception of America. Are we just trying to, take care of ourselves, or are we going to project power and might and force if at all necessary? Okay, we only have 6 more stories to go through. So here's one some of you all have doubtlessly heard about. This is from Hanania Naftali. We've seen him at a number of MJAA, IMCS events over the years. This was posted yesterday But breaking, the Israeli parliament just passed the first vote on a bill to bring the death penalty for terrorists who murder Israeli civilians. This is only the first of 4 votes. The law is not yet final, but it's still dramatic. And he says, I am 1,000% behind this bill. This is not something, of course, to rejoice over. I mean, the death of anyone is not something to be happy about, but this is intended to, especially in light from Israel's perspective of the Gaza conflict, terrorists, we capture you, we put you on trial, expect to be executed. So yeah, this is just another one of those developments we have to catalog. Okay, to the American home front, religious home front. Megan Basham, she has written a book. I forget the name of it, but it has to do with high-profile religious leaders. I don't have it in my library, but here she's passing on a story. The head of the counseling department at Biola University, one of the largest evangelical colleges in the country. Although, to be honest, you could be at any other or many different institutions, this same sort of thing could have happened, has declared herself an LGBTQ ally and filed an amicus brief in favor of Colorado's so-called conversion therapy ban, which prevents Christian counselors from using biblical teaching to help clients end unwanted LGBTQ behavior and identities. So here, of course, she says to scroll down, but the real story is that the drift and compromise Christian ethics are highlighting at Biola is happening all across the Christian higher ed landscape, often in more extreme ways. We need to talk about how our Christian educational institutions are being infiltrated by people who are not Christian. And yes, it was last year for my birthday, Hanukkah. I got a copy. I still haven't really looked through it that much, but I got a copy of the Upside Down Bible edited by Preston Sprinkle, among others. As I said, I haven't really looked at it that much. Sometime in the future, we're going to be updating and expanding our publication, Confronting Critical Issues, although that might still be a number of years away. So I have it on the list to, really spend some time flipping through that. But the point made is, in a lot of institutions, a lot of evangelical colleges and seminaries, which people would think of as being conservative, you got things like this going on, and you need to keep it in mind. When I was at Asbury Theological Seminary, that was from 2005 to 2009, so 20 years ago or so. Romans exegesis, we had to take 3 weeks reviewing Romans chapter 1 because of this very issue. And of course, it's developed since then. Some of you all are aware of how the vice president at Asbury Seminary, Stephen Harper, not to be confused with the Canadian Prime Minister, but yeah, Steve Harper, who had been a conservative evangelical Wesleyan, in 2015, he came out and he said, the same inductive Bible study techniques I taught my students, I applied to the different passages which apparently were prohibitive of homosexuality, and now I believe that 2 men or 2 women can be married. So this is something which, happens. It's an embarrassment for certain, but we need to take it seriously, and we need to have a better handle as believers, of course, on the matter of sexual ethics from the text. All right, to the Middle East. Syrian president on the occupation of the Golan Heights. Israel occupied the Golan Heights in order to protect Israel. And now they are imposing conditions in the south of Syria in order to protect the Golan Heights. So after a few years, maybe they will occupy the center of Syria in order to protect the south of Syria. They will reach Munich on that pathway. And you won't do a thing about it, is the commentary. Now, a lot of what is perceived as the Greater Israel Project is, right now just Israel creating some more buffer zones. They got the Golan Heights, which were once controlled by Syria, but you go on a tour to Israel and you see the Sea of Galilee, and your tour guide says, yeah, right over there is the Golan Heights. And it used to be that Syria could, basically fire missiles from that high position into Israel. And so we had to capture that in order to keep our people safe. Now, with the Druze situation being what it is, there's talk that, well, Israel's going to create a buffer to protect the Golan Heights, and then they're just going to take, little piece and little piece and little piece. This is just political commentary. We don't know. But we do know that this gets a lot of people, particularly both on the woke left and woke right, thinking that Israel has this steady project to take over the Middle East, which, of course, it doesn't. Israel is too small a country to do so. From open source intel, of course, this also shows you how things can and do change in the region. This is from today, 12:12 a.m., November the 12th. Syria's President al-Shara confirms direct talks with Israel advancing toward an agreement. So here you see one report which says that Israel's just going to try to take over these different pieces. Well, they got the Golan to protect Israel, then they got to get this other piece of territory to protect the Golan Heights, and then it just goes on and on. All right, to our backyard here in the Western Hemisphere from open source intel. This is from this morning, 1:14 a.m., November the 12th. The presence of the USS Gerald R. Ford off Latin America has put Venezuela's military on high alert. Amid growing signs, the Trump administration plans to step up its anti-drug campaign, the Washington Post reports. Now, this is, of course, the what's happening in Venezuela. We have reported in previous episodes, whether it's accurate or not, that Nicolas Maduro would be willing to possibly go into exile if the conditions were right, leave Venezuela, have the bounty taken off his head, just let him go live life in peace. Is the United States government interested solely in going after these narco-terrorists, drug traffickers? Is it seeking regime change? Well, one of the things we know for certain is that Venezuela has a larger oil reserve than Saudi Arabia does. There's more oil and gas in Venezuela than in the Middle East. And so is that a factor here? And what is the U.S. doing sending its most advanced nuclear aircraft carrier to the region? So we just continue to monitor it. Are there economic factors involved with this? Yes, there are. We don't need to be naive about that. And in our immediate backyard, this is from CBS News, Texas. CBS, Texas. Dallas County judge rules defamation lawsuit against Gateway Church Robert Morris can move forward. A Dallas County judge has ruled that a lawsuit filed against Gateway Church in Southlake by a survivor of sexual assault can move forward. So this is different from Robert Morris, who's presently in an Oklahoma jail, pleading guilty and then being able to leave later and probably on some kind of quasi-house arrest. Cindy Clemencher sued the church and its elders for defamation, claiming they downplayed and mischaracterized abuse she suffered as a child at the hands of the church's founder and former lead pastor, Robert Morris. The church asked the case be dismissed, arguing courts have no right to intervene in church matters. And Judge Emily Tobolowsky disagreed with the church, striking its argument down in a new ruling Tuesday. So Gateway Church is in the crosshairs here. And of course, this is something important for us. We have to take note of. Yes, in our local area, everybody's going to, be aware of Gateway Church, what's going to happen to all their different campuses. We know that they've had to let staff go. We know that they've had to trim back different programs and what have you. But for Messianic people, Gateway Church directly intersects with the Messianic Jewish movement because they've been very strong supporters of Israel, very strong supporters of different Messianic Jewish ministries. They've got the Gateway Center for Israel, which rightfully goes out and supports Israel, but you got this problem associated with Gateway. So you also have, of course, the King's University. And the King's University has a major Messianic Jewish Studies program. And the King's University, while independent, is nevertheless a part of the Gateway network. So if Gateway were to all of a sudden fold, would a King's University actually survive? And what would that mean for people who got their degrees at a King's University, their MDiv or something? How would that be perceived in the wider world of ideas? We do know people locally who were going to King's, but because of this Robert Morris situation, they've transferred to other schools, like a Dallas Theological Seminary, which, whether you like it or not, because of its dispensationalism, is still going to be around in the next 20 years. King's University, we don't know. We don't pray for these kinds of things. We don't hope for these kinds of terrible things, but we do know we have to be realistic about it. And what happens to Gateway does have a reverberating effect in the Messianic sphere of influence, all because of, this. But that's the world in which we live, and we pray that these kinds of situations can be resolved amicably. I don't want to see Gateway disappear, but unfortunately, that is a possibility, over the next couple of years. And I just saw something yesterday from a Messianic Jewish leader. He's getting ready to be ordained soon. But he said he went to seminary. And of course, my initial concern was, is he going to King's University? More so because, is he going to be able to have a degree which is respected down the road? Because what if King's folds? And surely enough, he wasn't going to King's. He was going to some other school. But yeah, this is the issue when you see the whole Gateway thing pop up. And I'm thankful that I got a degree from Asbury Theological Seminary, even though we definitely had to deal with LGBTQ students or more so than that, students who were more sympathetic than not toward it. They weren't gay or lesbian themselves. But people know about Asbury. It's going to be around for a very, very long time, whereas some of these other institutions, maybe not so much. Okay, enough said there. This concludes our news roundup. And as I said when we got started, I have probably a two-parter on Matthew 23, 2-3 planned for tomorrow and Friday, who sits in the seat of Moses. Some of you all are very familiar with that controversy, so it'll be a little longer than some of the previous teachings we've had this week, but I hope that we can have a fair discussion on that. All right. I think that concludes today. On behalf of Outreach Israel Ministries and Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support for all of our ministry efforts. If you have not already, do go to my website, messianicapologetics.net, where you can access a wide array of free articles, frequently asked questions entries, back issues of Outreach Israel News. You can check into some back episodes of Messianic Insider, different McKee moment shorts, etc. And please, if you have not, be sure to give this live stream a thumbs up or a heart. It'll definitely help its exposure on social media. We'll see you again tomorrow with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you, shalom, and take care.